The year 1812. War raged in Europe, and its effects could be felt across the globe. Napoleon established the Continental System, which restricted foreign trade with Britain, and the British had imposed strict embargoes on France in turn. Anybody who wanted to trade with France had to be approved by Britain first. Through the Orders in Council of 1806 and 1807, Britain regulated supplies reaching mainland Europe, and enacted a blockade of France to weaken their military. This was just the beginning of British attempts to fight against the threat Napoleon posed. Britain had a policy of pressing deserters found on foreign vessels into service in the Royal Navy, although they weren't exactly careful in determining if someone was a genuine deserter or not. So, on the other side of the ocean, a fledgling United States was feeling hard hit. By 1812, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 sailors had been taken from American ships and pressed into the Royal Navy. Up to this point, American merchants benefited from selling supplies to both sides of the war, and the US was making a name for itself as a nation on the grow. Yet, here Britain was, the country they gained independence from, telling them who they could trade with, and taking sailors from their ships to fight against a nominal ally. Not only that, Britain was hampering American efforts to expand westward by supporting native resistance to American settlers. This would not do. 14 years prior, America fought the quasi-war with France over similar issues, so they were not about to let Britain get away with such injustices. In the early 1800s, American politics were made up of two groups, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Within the Democratic Republicans was a highly influential war hawk faction, who favored war with Britain in retaliation for their supposed crimes against the US. These war hawks included Speaker of the House Henry Clay, future Vice President John C. Calhoun, and, in 1809, the President, Founding Father James Madison. The American government feuded with Britain about the restrictions and impressments for years, with President Madison calling for Americans to redress these grievances, saying, "Thousands of American citizens, under the safeguard of public law and of their national flag, have been torn from their country, and from everything dear to them, have been dragged on board ships of war of a foreign nation, and exposed, under the severities of their discipline, to be exiled to the most distant and deadly climes, to risk their lives in the battles of their oppressors, and to be the melancholy instruments of taking away those of their own brethren." American outrage over British imposition of the Orders in Council did not fall on deaf ears, however, and after years of protestations, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh announced the suspension of the orders on June 16, 1812, and they were fully repealed later that month. Would this have completely ended the practice of impressment and British resistance to American expansionism? Probably not. Impressment was an issue well before Napoleon, and Britain still needed to prevent supplies from reaching France's shores. But it did signal a willingness to compromise with America on these issues. After all, Britain needed their military's full attention focused on France, and didn't have the time to deal with a new war across the globe. This was, however, too late, as on June 18th, 2 days later, Congress passed a declaration of war on the United Kingdom, well before news of the suspension reached America. Now it was time for a fight. It should be noted that this was a pretty dumb political move on the part of the war hawks. Britain, while admittedly distracted with France, was still the world's foremost military power. If the war went poorly, many Americans feared Britain would reclaim her lost colonies. And even if it didn't go so far as that, an outright loss would have been disastrous for the Democratic Republicans. The declaration of war was passed without the support of any of the Federalists in Congress, and with only about 4/5 of the DRs. Support for the war, while widespread, was far from unanimous. Very few people wanted to be the ones to fight, and the declaration led to a lot of domestic troubles. When critics of the war voiced their opinions, pro-war protests formed, often becoming violent against the critics who they saw as subversives. The riot in Baltimore became particularly grotesque, with one witness recalling, "All I ever read of the French Revolution does not equal what I saw and heard last night. Such expressions as these were current. "We'll root out the damn Tories. We'll drink their blood. We'll eat their hearts." Horrifying. The early stages of the war saw neither side very well prepared. Britain assumed a total war was unlikely to occur and didn't plan proper defenses for Canada, and Madison banked on the idea that state militias would conquer the lightly defended Canada fairly quickly, leading to negotiations. So, in 1812, British regulars in Canada numbered only 6,000, while America had a standing army of around double that. The first actions of the war saw an American invasion led by General William Hull fail to gain much traction after Shawnee Chief Tecumseh ambushed and destroyed part of the American supply line at the Battle of Brownstown. Hull retreated to Fort Detroit, which was then besieged by a combined Shawnee-British force. Detroit was surrendered to the British General Isaac Brock. It should be noted, however, that Brock was killed during a second failed invasion near Niagara 2 months later. British and Shawnee forces then invaded Ohio, but were turned back at the siege of Fort Meigs, which is notable because future president and hero of the War of 1812, William Henry Harrison, oversaw the construction and defense of the fort. Harrison had been given command over the Army of the Northwest after Hull's failures, and held that position until 1814. Now, while I would like to begin discussing the main focus of this video, I think it's important that I give a little backstory for the major players during the Battle of Lake Erie, namely the American Commodore Perry and the British Commander Barclay, both of whom I've found to be extremely interesting characters. Oliver Hazard Perry was born to Revolutionary War veteran Christopher Perry and was the older brother of Matthew Perry. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. So his family lineage was one of great naval success. Christopher, in particular, I could do an entire video about, which I may someday, but for now it's important to know that Oliver learned his naval skills working under his father during the Quasi-War. Before 1812, Oliver Perry oversaw the construction of gunboats in Rhode Island, and by the outbreak of the war he was in command of a schooner called the USS Revenge. When he learned of the war, he requested to be sent to the Great Lakes, and, because of his experience with ship construction, he was put in charge of the construction of the American fleet for Lake Erie, at a place called Presque Isle. Stopping to support the Americans fighting at Fort George on Lake Ontario, he reached his destination by March of 1813. Commander Robert Harriet Barclay, on the British side, was born in Scotland, and joined the Royal Navy at the age of 11. He fought in the Battle of Trafalgar, but later lost his left arm while boarding a French vessel during a later battle. He survived the ordeal, and, still wanting to serve his country, he agreed to be sent to British North America. Soon after war was declared, he was offered a position as commander of the British forces on Lake Erie, which, at that time, included 2 schooners, 2 brigs, and 2 sloops. At the start of the war, the Americans had 1 ship, that being the USS Adams, which was captured by the British during the surrender of Detroit and renamed the HMS Detroit. This left the Americans in a very difficult position, and by the following September, the US government had authorized the construction of a fleet on Lake Erie at the behest of a local merchant ship captain, Daniel Dobbins. This construction project saw 4 schooners and 2 brigs built in less than a year, oftentimes using wood that hadn't been fully dried, which if you don't know, meant they'd fall apart much faster. But the US needed ships soon, and if they could secure control of the lake in one fell swoop, their short lifespans wouldn't be an issue. The first engagement between American and British sailors on Lake Erie came on October 8th, when a contingent of 100 American troops, under the command of Lieutenant Jesse Elliott, snuck aboard the HMS Detroit and the HMS Caledonia, which were anchored at Fort Erie near the mouth of the Niagara River. They successfully wrested away control of the ships, and sailed them towards the American harbor at Black Rock. The Caledonia was able to make it back safely, but the Detroit ran aground on a nearby island. The Americans, under heavy fire by artillery from Fort Erie, burned the vessel and abandoned ship. Meanwhile, the US government did secure the purchase of 2 more schooners and a sloop at Black Rock, the Somers, the Ohio, and the Trip. For a short while in mid-1813, American forces were even able to take Fort Erie, though this occupation did not last long and the position was abandoned on June 9th. Then, on June 14th, Perry ordered all US ships at Black Rock to move to Presque Isle, where the remainder of the US fleet was being built. Barclay, who had taken his command of the British fleet just 9 days earlier, left his base in search of the Americans, but the weather turned poor, and Perry was able to slip away in a dense fog. Now, Presque Isle was a fantastic choice for a base of operations. More properly a peninsula, the only way in or out of its bay is across a sandbar that is, at its most, 5 feet deep. Also guarded by American fortifications, Perry's fleet was untouchable while hidden away here, and, by July, all of the ships were complete. Alongside the Caledonia, the Somers, the Ohio, and the Trip, Perry now also commanded 4 more schooners, the Scorpion, the Ariel, the Porcupine, and the Tigress, as well as 2 brigs, the Niagara, and Perry's flagship, the Lawrence. The Lawrence was named after American Captain James Lawrence, who died during single-ship action against a British frigate near Boston the month prior. As he lay mortally wounded, he begged his crew, "Tell the men to fire faster! Don't give up the ship!" Unfortunately, the Americans suffered too many casualties, and their vessel, the USS Chesapeake, was captured. This event became a rallying cry for Americans, and Perry chose those words to become his personal standard for the ship that bore the late captain's name. With the addition of the 6 new ships, the Americans now outnumbered the British 10-5 on Lake Erie. While both fleets were significantly undermanned, the Americans had around 60 more seamen, if more thinly spread across their greater number of vessels. The British did have more cannons on their ships, though they were, on average, half as small as the American cannons, since they had been scavenged from British forts around the lake. Additionally, they were in much worse condition compared to the American guns, with some having to be fired by discharging a pistol over the touch hole, which sounds like a nightmare. While a direct assault of Perry's fleet was impossible due to the sandbar, Barclay did gauge the strength of American defenses with a skirmish on July 21st, but he determined that they were too overwhelming and resorted to a blockade of the area. However, on July 29th, Barclay abandoned his blockade. Now, I've seen a lot of people criticize the move as one of the most foolish things Barclay could have done and as the nail in the coffin for the British on Lake Erie, but I disagree. Lifting the blockade actually gave them a major strategic advantage, one that Barclay was well aware of. To meet his opponent, Perry would have to cross the sandbar, a lengthy and difficult undertaking. If Barclay could catch the Americans in the middle of the crossing, he could meet a portion of Perry's fleet with the full force of his own. If timed properly, the American fleet could be decimated, or worse, giving the British greater strength than the Americans in any future engagement, or at least continuing British domination of the lake for many more months. As soon as the British were out of sight, Perry began the process of crossing the sandbar. To clear the high floor of the lake, Perry had specialized barges constructed. A ship would be attached to one of these barges, the ballast would be removed along with the ship's cannons, and the whole vessel would rise much higher than it normally could, allowing it to pass over the sandbar, a process that is extremely complicated and extremely time-consuming. By August 4th, Perry had succeeded in crossing the sandbar and rearming 8 of his 10 ships. The only 2 left were the new brigs Perry had built, the Niagara and the Lawrence. Then the British returned. Barclay had successfully reached the Americans mid-crossing, and before the powerhouses of their fleet could be of use. However, he was still outnumbered by the ships that had crossed, and the organized line of American gunboats convinced him that they were ready for a fight. This was not what Barclay had hoped for, and he left defeated. Yet, he did have one last card to play. The British fleet at this point was made up of 2 sloops, the HMS Queen Charlotte and the HMS Little Belt, 2 schooners, the HMS Chippewa and the HMS Lady Prevost, and 1 brig, the HMS General Hunter. However, back at Barclay's base in Amherstburg, a new ship, larger than any other vessel on Lake Erie, was being constructed. Named after the captured but lost American ship, the HMS Detroit would soon become a force to be reckoned with for Perry and his men. After escaping from Presque Isle, Perry sailed to Ohio, where he gathered supplies and new sailors. After goading Barclay with a show of force at Amherstburg, Perry established an anchorage off South Bass Island at a place called Put-in Bay. There he waited for the British to make a move. Meanwhile, he sent Dobbins away for supplies along with the Ohio. The Americans would have 9 ships in the battle. Effectively blockaded by the new American fleet and facing a flood of native refugees because of Harrison's campaigns, Barclay knew he had to face Perry in a decisive fight. On September 9th of 1813, Barclay's 6 ships set off in search of the Americans, and on the next day they found them. The British strategy entering the battle was to pick off the American ships one at a time, focusing the whole fleet on the brigs first, then the smaller gunboats, all while using the wind to outmaneuver Perry. The Americans, meanwhile, decided that victory would come by engaging each of the British ships 2-on-1. Since the Americans outnumbered the British, they could use their larger force to overwhelm the enemy. Early in the morning of September 10th, Perry spotted the British fleet north of the island. Engaging them immediately, he placed the Niagara ahead of his flagship because he anticipated the Queen Charlotte would be the British lead. As the two sides inched closer and closer, Perry realized the British had the Detroit in front instead of the Queen Charlotte, and rushed to correct his mistake. Then, at around noon, the Detroit opened fire. And yet the winds shifted. Barclay lost his maneuverability advantage. Perry took the opportunity and charged the British line with his ship, hoping to put his strategy into play. But the rest of his fleet fell behind, and the Lawrence suffered total bombardment for 20 minutes before finally getting the British fleet within range. Perry exchanged fire with the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte for the next 2 hours, but it was too much for the Lawrence. She had turned into a floating husk, with Perry on board. Amid the carnage and smoke, Perry reached for his flag and abandoned ship. When the British saw Perry's rowboat fleeing from the battle, they opened fire on him. If Perry could regain command of his fleet from another vessel, however, the battle might not yet be decided. Swerving between cannon shots and crashing over waves, Perry and his surviving crew made the arduous trip back to the Niagara, with his servant, a free African-American named Cyrus Tiffany, personally protecting him as they went along. So far, things seemed to be going well for Barclay. His plan to target one ship at a time was working. The U.S. flagship was dead in the water, and Perry was scrambling to get back to his next best ship. Except, fire from the American side had done a number on the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte. The rigging on both ships had been badly damaged, and a stunningly high number of British officers lay dead or injured on their decks. Barclay himself received injuries to one of his legs as well as his remaining arm. The unmaneuverability of the ships and a lack of direction from the officers, combined with their proximity, was a dangerous mix. Unable to regain control of the situation, and with the Niagara pressing down on them, the 2 lead ships of the British fleet collided. Suddenly, the Americans had the upper hand. Perry, having safely reached and taken control of the Niagara, capitalized on the opportunity, and proceeded to barrage the entangled vessels while the remaining American gunboats moved in support. This was too much for Barclay. He was surrounded, and the Americans were dismantling the British fleet 1 cannonball at a time. 3 hours after fighting had started, Barclay struck the Detroit's colors and surrendered. Of the 465 or so British sailors, 41 were killed, and the rest were captured and brought to Erie as prisoners of war. Americans suffered 123 casualties, and the Lawrence was left severely damaged. Still, the day belonged to Perry, a momentous achievement earned for his young republic, which didn't even have 1 ship on the lake, just the year before. After the battle, Perry wrote to Harrison, notifying him of the victory on Lake Erie, saying, "Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours." The battle gave the Americans complete supremacy on the lake. Between Perry's domination of the South and Harrison's position in the East, enough pressure was put on Detroit that it had to be abandoned by the British entirely, to the understandable disgruntlement of their native allies. This allowed the U.S. to regain its lost territory in Michigan, and Lake Erie served as a launching point for Harrison's invasion of Canada 17 days later. Then, on October 5th, Harrison fought combined British and native forces at the Battle of the Thames. Tecumseh was killed, and his Confederacy began its collapse as a result. Barclay was eventually released to British authorities and customarily court-martialed for the defeat at Put-in Bay. It was determined, however, that he gave a valiant effort in the fight, and blame for the loss fell to a lack of support in supplies and manpower by British High Command. Barclay was given a pension of £200 a year, and despite attempts to rejoin the Navy, returned to Britain, where he married and spent the rest of his life with his wife and children. Perry used his position on Lake Erie to support Harrison's efforts in Canada, and later helped in the defense of Washington during the 1814 Chesapeake Campaign, earning him admiration throughout the country. After the war, however, he found himself embroiled in several controversies. He assaulted another officer, which led to a duel, literally held on the same field in Weehawken where Hamilton and Burr had their infamous duel 13 years prior. He was challenged to another duel by Jesse Elliott, who served under him in the Battle of Lake Erie. He refused that one and filed charges against the officer, which he dropped in exchange for a diplomatic mission from President Monroe. It would seem politics have always been weird. During the mission, he met with the vice president of Gran Colombia before falling ill with yellow fever and passing away in 1819 on his 34th birthday.